So welcome to day two. This is essentially where I'm just working on wrapping up the filing of the headstock, which is coming along quite nicely. We've pretty much wrapped up this bit here. I'm just leaving the very edges around here, and as you can see, it gets a little bit more here. I've got more work to do along here where the pencil line is, but I just want to just leave the last little bit so I can do possibly a slightly smoother finish without wearing away too much more of the material. Just for the corners here of the, for the curve here I should say, what I've been using is a chisel handle with a piece of sandpaper wrapped around it, and just for the future use in the autopsy, I still have the blade attached to this handle, and it is a formidably sharp blade, so yes, when the coroner wonders how this all happened, the video should be fairly clear as to the circumstances of my eventual demise. So let's see how it goes. Okay, so excitingly, we can see that the shape of basically the Telecaster headstock is now taking on its fairly characteristic, or extremely characteristic look. Now, what I want to do last, as I said, is look at it with some finer grit paper. But I'm also going to take the square around here, and whilst I've used a block nearly the entire time of some way, shape or form, what I'm going to do with just the last little bit with some slightly higher grit paper is just try and make sure it's relatively square. I'm not that concerned about it. I mean, visually it looks, I think, pretty good, but what I want to do is just sort of make sure there's no standout points while I've got a little bit of room to move, at least up here. I've noticed previously as I've been going around, I've obviously had a tendency to sort of drive the sandpaper in this way a little bit, and it's sort of pushed a slightly off square curve in a couple of areas. Not anything particularly big to worry about, but you know, I'd rather keep it as close to square as I can. Okay, so I think that is pretty much it done. So what's next? And you can see it's fairly nice and smooth now. I'm not going berserk on the finish just yet. The whole thing has to be sanded within an inch of its life yet. But looking at it, I'm quite happy with some of the details here. I'm really quite happy with how the curve of the neck runs at this nice angle into the cut of the headstock shape. We've got a nice, even, smooth curve around here. Again, this will get touched up, and I mean, I may find some little bits that I want to just slightly modify once we get into the really fine sanding. But at this stage, I think we're good to go. So, next thing is taping up all of the neck, the fretboard between the frets, because what we've got to do next is actually check the basically the straightness of the frets one to each other, so along the length of them. Once that's done, then we'll have to do the recrowning, and as you can see, some of these are a little bit, there was a couple of good examples which naturally I can't spot at the moment, but where the frets have sort of come in a little bit shorter. There it is. It's this one here, so that may get, we may have to knock that out, or at least sort of bang it down a little bit further with a hammer to get it straight. But other than that, we're good to go. So next thing will be taping. Also, I've got to knock the nut out, which shouldn't be a problem, should be just glued in. We've got this is just a plastic nut. We're going to replace it with a bone one that I've got lying around somewhere. And then we are at the stage of prepping for the painting. So we'll see how we go with the next step. The bit that I forgot to mention actually is actually checking now that the neck is straight, or at least seeing what condition it's in, and for that we use a straight rule like this that's got these notches cut out for the frets, and you can see as we lay it down, naturally the spaces work out, but the upshot being is you can see that as we move it forward to back, that when it's aligned, that the frets are generally, or the neck I should say, is generally straight. There's just maybe a fraction of a bow in it, which is okay, because what's going to happen is when it's like this, you kind of want the shape of it like the rainbow shape, just slightly, because when the pressure comes on the strings across here, it's naturally going to be sort of resolving that shape, or that's the idea anyway. But that's what we've got the truss rod for in here, if needs be, where we can adjust the convex or concavity of the neck. So we'll crack on with that from there. Something worth adding here that I realised I misspoke yesterday, or actually misunderstood what the directions were saying, was with regards to actually checking that the neck is straight. There's a passage in the guide actually that talks about the bowing and basically the change of shape of the neck once the string tension comes on, but I hadn't actually sort of put two and two together when it comes to the leveling of the frets, for reasons which I can't really add much to. So what I've done is I've just gone back with the straight edge and just double checked that indeed everything is straight in terms of the neck, which it is, because when it comes to the leveling of the frets, if it isn't, obviously if the neck isn't straight, it's going to change later, and we're aiming to get these nice and basically coming to a smooth but sort of noticeable peak at the top of the fret, so there is like an area of definite pressure on the string, which is what we're looking for. So if we did it when it wasn't straight, then of course when the neck shape changes, that's going to mean that I imagine what would be a fairly small change, but one I'd rather avoid. So I'm just going to tape up now the sides of the fret here, and then put some marker on the top, and we'll take a look how we go from there. So you can see now I've taken my official Sharpie brand Sharpie and run a line of blue marker over the top of the frets. Now the next step, when I can find it, is I am looking for the tool that I need. Here it is, right in plain sight, of course. Now this is what I bought with the kit, which is a leveling device, and it's just different abrasive papers adhered onto it here. Now what's interesting is that the level of grit on this is fine, to say the least. That feels like 200-300-y sort of stuff. This is not quite as fine, but so we're just going to give it a bash, see what happens. This will be the first step. We've got to essentially, using this, if this isn't enough, what I'll do is I'll take some middling level wet dry paper like this, and basically just wrap it around here, and the main thing we're looking for is a straight edge, which when we run it over the frets, will basically show if any of them are sitting proud, or if there's any of them are not sitting straight in line or anything like that, and this should give us a guide as to how that works out. So let's give that a bash, and we'll see how we go from there. So whilst, as you can see, this is good for one guitar neck only, it's taken off those two bits entirely. Not quite on that side, it's slightly fractionally unfair for want of about another 3 goes over the fretboard. What you can see is that, well, you may or may not be able to see, first of all, there wasn't really any problem with leaving Sharpie on anything, which is great, but I realise now actually that the moving or using the a more aggressive paper would have probably been a bit interesting, because as you can sort of see here, light pressure, not a few minutes work tops, and it's actually taken like it's noticeably flattened the frets. I was actually expecting them not really to move at all, but you can see just how much carbon type dust there is sitting on the fretboard. So whilst some of that's going to be the wet and dry paper, some of it's going to be texture, some of it is also stainless steel that's been, or nickel that's been worn away there. So yeah, more pressure better, less pressure better than more, and less adhesive paper, higher grit paper is yeah, definitely the way of the future. So the next thing we are onto is using this. Now this is our grounding file. And what this enables us to do now, various recommendations about whether to use these or not. This is obviously my first time using one, so we'll see how it goes. But you can see it's got a shape that is designed to basically fit over the fret. Now, more professional users tend to use a file that's been sort of smoothed on all but one side, and so that it won't actually dig into the wood here. Hopefully we've got enough masking tape over here, so yeah, hoping for the best. But yeah, the next part is the crowning, which will basically run this smooth with just the, as I say, the very finest peak on it. And at the same time, I'll just get another file or some sandpaper and just make sure these ends are nice and smooth, so that they don't grab once playing. So I think that's the end of the crowning. Actually, what I went to do was I looked at some of the guitars inside just to sort of see how their frets look, because it's kind of a little bit hard to know exactly what you're going for. It's one of the things I found with this already, is it's amazing how many details you actually start to look at that you never really give much consideration to otherwise. So it's I think that's roughly what we're looking for here. The next step is to get some fairly fine sandpaper of the wet dry variety, and give it a bit of a start the buffing process. Then we use some 4-0 steel wool for the next part, and then almost certainly we will crack out the Dremel and do the final polishing with a little bit of buffing compound to make the whole thing look pretty. Just a small lesson for the future. As you can see there, the newer bit of masking tape that I've just put on. The lesson is when you're buying masking tape, buy thick roll like that's good, and then get the finest roll they have, because what I've had to do with basically every bit apart from the first fret was the only one where I haven't had to cut the masking tape. And then actually what I should have done, and I noticed watching later from Crimson Guitars, was actually putting down at least 2 layers. So there's a bit of goop has already sort of gone through onto the fretboard, which isn't a huge drama because it hasn't been painted or anything yet, so it'll just most likely wipe off, but certainly a note for the future. So what I'm doing now, I've many bits of wet and dry paper folded up like this later. I'm just going through each fret individually, and if I'm a bit muffled, I'm actually using a dust mask. After the sanding yesterday, I've realised that when you're looking close at stuff while you're sanding it, you're probably inhaling a lot more than you expect. So it's not as butch as I would necessarily like to be, but yeah, all the sandust or sawdust I ate yesterday was not overly healthy. So I'm just feeling each of these frets to check if there's any sort of rough spots, and there's a little bit on there which I'll take when I put the camera down. But generally, apart from that one, that's the first one I've seen that feels a little bit off, so I'll just smooth that off, and then we're onto the steel wool. Just to illustrate the use of the dust mask, once I started on the 4-0 steel wool, you can see just how fine and icky this stuff is. So I actually tend to just blow it away with the vacuum cleaner periodically, but yeah, I think it's well worth using a dust mask to avoid inhaling even a little bit of this stuff. I'm fairly confident this won't show up on camera, but I thought it was worth sort of demonstrating that you can see, I think, quite easily when the it's almost certainly not going to show up on camera, but it is. You'll have to take my word for it. As we're sort of moving over these with the steel wool, the scratches basically disappear. So you can kind of, I think, see here, this is the last one that I've done, and here there's still plenty of sort of light scratches and so forth. So these are getting, and these are very smooth under finger, so that's good. So it's definitely having an effect using the steel wool, which is the second last step here. So final step now is, and these are looking pretty tasty now, I think. So they're certainly smooth under finger, which is good to know. And what we're going to do now is just use this little polishing wheel on the Dremel and hopefully get everything up to a very nice shine. My two impediments, naturally the Dremel is flat, so I'm talking about it now just so I've got enough charge to do this part of it. And the second thing, which I haven't opened yet, this polishing compound feels slightly dubious in terms of consistency, so I'm worried the air's got in there. I've got some somewhere else kicking around, but we'll just hope for the best on this one and see how we go. Happily, the second lot of compound I found is viable. That's this one over here, which is still good. This one here is so funny, well, not really funny, haha, or the other type, but had to get the Stanley knife to get this thing open. It was sealed up so tightly. It was almost an accident waiting to happen, and yet, despite all of that air, it's still gotten in there. So, yeah, dangerously and ineffectively packed. So, winning combination there. Okay, so we've been around and polished all of the frets with the Dremel now, which is, well, they don't look good yet because they've still got to be polished off with cloth. But what I'm going to do, just before we get there, I've just got these little doodads, which are just these little aluminium fret protectors. And what I'm going to do is just go over the tops. I've been a little bit cautious with some aspects of using the Dremel because of the tape. I don't want to drive through it. It's not the end of the world, but ideally I just would rather have less cleanup, and I don't want to really force the polish into the wood because then that will probably cause some problems. So what I'm going to do is just give the Dremel a bit of a top-up charge, and then put some final material on the sort of tops of the frets, applying, you know, with more speed and more pressure. Keeping in mind that apparently if you run these the Dremels fast enough and hard enough onto the frets, it can heat them up sufficiently to break the glue under the frets, so we'll try to avoid that, and it'll make for some interesting footage afterwards if I do. Okay, so we can see now that the tape's off and this has been polished. Again, I mean, it probably doesn't show up as well as you would like, but yeah, these are pretty shiny now. Now you can see actually a little bit there where some of the polish has managed to get through onto the fretboard below. Not a huge drama. I was just trying with a tiny little bit of sandpaper, just seeing how easily it rubs off. It comes off fine, so I should possibly take it off now, but I'm not going to because not entirely why, but not entirely sure why, but we're still not going to because I'm pretty much wrapped for the day now. But the exciting thing is this now leads us, this completes this stage of the build. Don't have to worry about the crud on the neck, on the nut there. It's the nut's coming out anyway. The exciting thing is that we now head into the sanding stage. So everything, body, neck, everything, body in particular, neck, because it's being stained or just lightly basically oiled, is going to not require as much sanding. The body will require heaps because it's getting painted, so it has to be taken care of very well. What we'll be doing with the body is actually sanding it back reasonably, and then I'll be using some grain filler in there, sanding it again. So that's going to obviously be quite a significant job. The next thing also is purchasing of paint, which has to come up from Sydney. It's looking at, I think it was roughly $35, $45 a can of spray paint, so it's not exactly inexpensive, but hopefully will give the desired effect once we're complete. So that wraps up for the day, and we'll get into the sanding when I have my next bit of spare time. One other thing I just noticed before we wrap up actually is, and I had meant to put this on a towel while I was playing around with it and sanding and so forth. Nothing enormously damaging here, but you can see there's a little bit of a scrub there, and there's a bit of marking down here where it's just been rubbing against the table while I've been sanding it and so forth. So it's not overly bad, but it's certainly, if this was a more expensive piece of wood, I would maybe more upset with myself. But yeah, another lesson for the future there is to certainly put something soft under the surface while we're sanding and working on it.